Israel caught off guard after the largest and deadliest escalation of violence in decades. Tonight, rockets and airstrikes continue to rain down on Israel and Gaza after a day of shock, death, and destruction.
אזרחי ישראל, אנחנו במלחמה, לא במבצע.
That's the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu declaring war against Hamas. Good evening, and thank you for joining us. At dawn local time, Hamas militants launched an unprecedented and large-scale surprise attack targeting dozens of locations in Israel. Right now, Israeli authorities say at least 200 people in Israel have been killed. The Gaza Health Ministry says 232 Palestinians are dead. Gunmen stormed across Israel's southern border near the Gaza Strip on foot and by air using motorized paragliders to sweep into several border towns, taking soldiers and civilians hostage. Joel Senick begins our coverage tonight, and we want to warn you, our reporting contains images that may be disturbing.
Without warning, violence and chaos erupts in the Middle East. The Palestinian militant group Hamas striking Israel with thousands of rockets and sending groups of gunmen across the border. A surprise early Saturday morning attack taking place during one of the holiest weekends on the Jewish calendar. A stunned Israel now declaring war and vowing to inflict what Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu calls an unprecedented price.
I have ordered an extensive mobilization of reserves and that we return fire of a magnitude that the enemy has not known. We are at war and we will win it.
Hamas's military leader says the assault is in response to the blockade of Gaza, Israeli raids inside the West Bank, and violence at a disputed holy site. Israeli forces striking back, flattening a high-rise building in Gaza City and mobilizing troops across the country. At one point, security forces said there were almost 24 ongoing gun battles.
Very scary situation. Many people have died already, and we hear about people being kidnapped.
Video from Hamas appears to show its fighters inside Israeli army camps. A spokesperson for the group says it's holding dozens of Israeli soldiers captive, while Israel says Hamas also has civilian hostages.
Allahu Akbar!
Reuters releasing this video, which appears to show the moment one of those captives was taken back into Gaza. In Washington, President Joe Biden condemning the attacks in a rare Saturday address, saying he spoke by phone with Prime Minister Netanyahu.
Let there be no mistake. The United States stands with the state of Israel.
The U.S. Defense Secretary is also in contact with his Israeli counterpart, saying he will work to ensure Israel has the support it needs, with no timeline for the end of this conflict. Joel Senick, Global News, Washington.
Like several other global airlines, Air Canada is moving temporarily to cancel its flights to Tel Aviv starting on Sunday. Of course, in a response to these attacks, the carrier says it's going to be monitoring the situation and it will adjust flights accordingly. The United Nations Security Council is going to be holding an emergency meeting tomorrow on the situation, with the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres condemning today's attack and voicing his deep concern for the civilians that have been caught in the conflict. Touria Izri has more on how Canada is responding alongside the international community.
The surprise attack stunned Israel and the world, setting off swift condemnation from Western leaders, including Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. He tweeted, "Canada strongly condemns the current terrorist attacks against Israel. We stand with Israel and fully support its right to defend itself." Opposition leader Pierre Poilievre also tweeted, "I unequivocally condemn the invasion of Israel by Hamas terrorists and the sadistic violence they have subsequently carried out against innocent civilians."
We are facing a horrendous terrorist attack that has really no precedent, I think, in our region or in the history.
British Prime Minister Rishi Sunak expressed his shock. So did Britain's Foreign Secretary.
And the UK completely condemns these terrorist acts against Israel, and we support Israel's right to self-defense.
President of the European Union Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, called the Hamas incursion pure terrorism.
C'est purement du terrorisme.
French leader Emmanuel Macron discussed the situation with the Prime Minister of Israel and the President of the Palestinian Authority and pledged his commitment to Israel's security. A stark contrast to the scenes unfolding in Tehran. Celebrations erupted in the streets after the carefully coordinated attack by Hamas, which is backed by the Iranian regime. Next door in Turkey, President Erdogan pleaded for restraint, urging all sides to avoid being impulsive and heightening tensions. The Turks have recently warmed ties with Israel, so have the Saudis, who are in negotiations brokered by the U.S. to normalize relations with the Israeli government. In a statement, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia renewed its calls for a two-state solution and says it made repeated warnings of the dangers as a result of the continued occupation and the deprivation of Palestinian people and their legitimate rights. Palestinian leaders say for too long the conflict has been ignored.
The world community has done nothing to stop an occupation that has become the longest in modern history.
The United Nations is urging maximum restraint, appealing to both sides to de-escalate and stop further bloodshed. Touria Izri, Global News, Ottawa.
Benjamin Netanyahu is Israel's longest-serving prime minister. And over his 16 years in office, he's faced numerous flare-ups and violence with Palestinian militants, a cascade of elections, serious legal battles, and chaotic street protests. But as Redmond Shannon reports, this could be the greatest crisis Netanyahu has ever had to deal with.
Addressing the nation Saturday night, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu promised mighty vengeance against Hamas. It is almost exactly 50 years since Israel's longest-serving Prime Minister served in the Yom Kippur War, a conflict that caught Israel off guard. Now, as Prime Minister, he is dealing with what appears to be another massive intelligence failure. Events never before seen since the foundation of Israel. The Hamas invasion, killings and kidnapping of Israelis comes in a year that Netanyahu is dealing with waves of disruptive protests against judicial reforms. His critics alleging the proposals erode the independence of Israel's judiciary. Netanyahu is also facing ongoing trials for bribery and fraud. And he is steering the country's most right-leaning coalition government ever. Opposition leader Yair Lapid says he will put aside the bitter differences and take up Netanyahu's offer to form an emergency unity government.
The real problem for Benjamin Netanyahu is not the near term. I think there's a lot of unanimity in Israel on what to do in the near term. The real problem is going to come in 2, 3, 4 weeks' time when the Israelis try to figure out what's the end state of this conflict.
Previous hostage situations in the region have played out for months or even years. The longer it drags on, the louder the dissenting voices will become.
Netanyahu has been attacked on his right and his left for his entire career, and that doesn't really faze him. That's just the nature of life. Netanyahu is fighting for his political survival, as he always does.
This unprecedented crisis will likely test Netanyahu like never before. Redmond Shannon, Global News, London.
For more now on what these latest escalations could mean, Cliff Kupchan joins us now. He's the chairman of the Eurasia Group. Appreciate you joining us, Cliff. First, I want to ask you, Benjamin Netanyahu says Hamas will pay a huge price. So what's next?
It would be very hard for the prime minister not to do something that Israel's avoided doing for 20 years, going into the Gaza Strip, a land war, dismantling Hamas's operational capability, taking down as much of Hamas's leadership as he can. That's not necessarily next, but that's a major escalation that I think we're on the cusp of as we speak.
You know, a lot of people are wondering how Israeli defense forces were caught off guard. So how did this happen?
I think Israel's had two national preoccupations, I would say. First, the battle over clipping the wings of the Supreme Court so that Mr. Netanyahu gets all sorts of new powers. Second, less in the headlines. The Israeli Defense Forces have really been concentrating on the West Bank. And it may be the case that we learn soon that they've taken their eye off the South. And that vulnerability has been exploited, rather adroitly, unfortunately, by Hamas. But that still doesn't get to the question of, as you started, what we do next, and that's a real problem.
Okay, do we know who was helping Hamas, and if so, how big could this get?
Well, that's the $64,000 question. The big 800-pound elephant looming in the background of all of this is Iran. Iran is Hamas's most significant major patron. Iran is the one that, if it has been involved in planning this, if it continues to, we've got to watch this really carefully. If Iran provides arms to Hamas as this war develops and continues, and third, if Hezbollah, another one of Iran's patrons, joins the war and opens a second front, then we got a big problem. Because if Iran indeed has its fingerprints all over this, then Israel is going to be very tempted to hit Iranian bases, per se, in Iran. And then we're off to the races. Then we got a much wider war. Then we could have Iran and its allies attacking Israel. And then what does the U.S. do? So don't want to get ahead of the game here, but that's what I'm really watching to see if this spreads and becomes a geopolitical, firestorm.
Cliff Kupchan, the chairman of the Eurasia Group, thanks so much for joining us.
It's my pleasure. Thank you.
We'll have more on the situation in the Middle East later on in the program, but we're going to turn to other news of the day. In Afghanistan, hundreds are feared dead after a pair of powerful earthquakes crumbled buildings near the Iranian border. Severe damage could be seen near the city of Herat after a 6.3 magnitude quake struck the region, followed by a powerful 5.5 magnitude aftershock. Local authorities estimate about 120 people were killed, with more than 1,000 others said to be injured. Those figures are expected to rise as the race is now on to find people who are trapped under the rubble. Here at home, calls are growing for the expansion of a new weapon to fight illness as cold and flu season kicks off. Last month, Health Canada approved a vaccine for RSV for adults aged 60 and older. Doctors say this shot is a game changer, but they also worry that many seniors won't be able to afford it. Health reporter Catherine Ward explains.
Respiratory syncytial virus can have devastating outcomes.
I've seen a number of patients unfortunately die in our hospitals every year. We know that thousands of people are dying every year, mostly older people, from this virus.
Dr. Samir Sinha is thrilled shots for seniors will go into arms this fall. However, he warns a patchwork of publicly funded coverage will undermine the vaccine's effectiveness.
Unfortunately, it's not covered for most older Canadians at the moment. It then comes up to the provinces to make a determination as to whether they're going to cover this or not, and how they will allow it to be administered.
Ontario has chosen to publicly fund the vaccine for people 60 and older living in most congregate care settings. Other provinces say they are awaiting federal guidelines before determining whether they will follow suit. In BC, the cost for an RSV vaccine is roughly $230.
Experts say some private insurance plans will cover the cost of getting a RSV vaccine. Further guidance from NACI isn't expected until next fall.
If you don't have coverage by the provincial health plan that you're in, then it's going to be up to you to see if you can afford to keep yourself healthy. And that is absolutely not what we want for vaccines.
Advocates say it's important older Canadians are not forgotten.
We haven't done a good job keeping track of how common this is and how prevalent it is. We've continued to under-recognize the burden in older adults.
You would think with COVID-19 that we would take vaccines really seriously and that governments would want to fund all NACI recommended vaccines, but it hasn't been the case.
Catherine Ward, Global News, Toronto.
Paris being plagued by pests. Coming up, frustration in the City of Lights now swarmed by bedbugs. Paris may be known as the City of Lights, but the French capital is also earning a new reputation due to a growing problem. The French capital is struggling with a surge in bedbug infestations in both private homes and public spaces. As Mike Armstrong explains, the anger and anxiety over the nasty insects has sparked a political crisis.
They may be small in size, but bedbugs are keeping exterminators more than a little busy. For this Paris company, home visits have jumped about 60%, and in their shop, about 80% of sales are products for just one little bug.
Le client, il a fait appel à nous, malheureusement, parce qu'il a...
He says the owner called them to this apartment after going to a movie theater and then finding a bed bug at home. Now, it's that going out part that has people nervous. Social media is full of videos of bed bugs found in theaters and trains. It's made it hard to sit just about anywhere. This woman says she was stressed out going out. Well, this woman says when she gets back home, she'll wash all her clothes. We're becoming paranoid, she says. Well, after signs of bed bugs were found at this school Thursday, 80 teachers walked off the job. Exterminators are now set to go in next week. Bed bugs are a disaster, this teacher says. There's no way we're bringing them back to our homes.
Une vague de panique saisit le pays.
An opposition politician this week called the situation a national public health problem, saying a wave of panic is gripping the country. So how big an issue is it? Well, the French Health Authority says between 2017 and 2022, 1 in 10 French households was infested. This expert says the population of bed bugs in the country is doubling every 5 years.
So it's rising quite slowly, but at a regular rate, so it's quite concerning, of course.
Now, bed bugs aren't a hygiene issue. If they're found, it's something someone brought in. They do feed on blood and usually bite during the night. They can also be a mental health issue with frustration and fear leading to anxiety. This exterminator says people can fall into depression. He has customers who call in tears. Now, the two biggest factors for this growing problem, according to the government, are greater resistance to insecticides and an increase in tourism. Well, with Paris hosting the Olympics next summer, tourism isn't something that's going to slow down. Mike Armstrong, Global News.
Ahead, naming feelings, the new English term used to describe how people are coping emotionally with the new reality of the climate crisis. The climate crisis is changing the lives of many people in Canada and really around the world. Devastating fires, floods, and destruction this past summer are prompting some experts to refer to it as a summer of climate reality. So even if you weren't evacuated or impacted, you might know someone who was. This week on The New Reality, we're looking into a fairly new English term that may help us describe how we feel as we witness the environment irreversibly change around us.
Have you noticed a lot of changes in the weather and the ice over your lifetime?
This is what research can look like for Ashley Consolo. Her work, spanning decades, focuses on how environmental change, fueled by the climate crisis, impacts our mental and emotional health.
Yes, there's a lot of changes. But everybody knows it, especially in the last 2 or 3 years. Everything is mixed up.
Consolo's had hundreds of conversations, often outside, in places people feel connected to nature.
When you see your home change, or when you see things, shifting in ways that don't make sense, or that don't match, or that affect your identity, the pain, the trauma, the loss, the sadness, the fear, the worry about future generations, all of that is interconnected.
Elder Jean Crane is in her mid-90s, a lifetime of lived experience on the land.
Labrador is at the front lines of the climate crisis. It's one of the fastest warming places anywhere in the world. The sea ice has declined, or the weather has changed, or the animals have moved. People here for decades have been experiencing what in other parts of the world people are still thinking is a future impact.
Indigenous communities have been speaking about feelings linked to environmental change for a long time. But it wasn't until 2018 when Consolo and a colleague published a paper using a new term in English to describe it: ecological grief.
Whether it's an individual animal, whether it's an ecosystem, a habitat, a body of water, a forest, large-scale climate shifts, anything that is changing around us that is causing an emotional reaction, particularly grief.
And while this grief is normal and a healthy response, finding ways to cope can be challenging.
Sometimes you do need other types of supports, and counseling support is hugely important in these times of crisis. Having strong family and friend networks, having collectives of people that understand what you're going through and that want to make a difference.
We grieve what we love, and the place we call home is changing.
Like, I have felt more devastated this summer than I have in a long time, and simultaneously more inspired and motivated. And you see what people love, and then what they love is worth fighting for.
We'll take a deeper dive into the ways people are coping with ecological grief and what it means for our health on The New Reality tonight at 7 o'clock. Next, we return to the violence between Israeli forces and Hamas and the innocents caught in the crossfire. What's happening in Israel and Gaza is difficult to watch. And in the days and the weeks ahead, there will be a lot of analysis and reflection about how decades of fragile coexistence has seemingly vanished. Whatever the perceived justification on each side, it's the innocent lives being cut short and those caught in the crosshairs, which is absolutely shattering. Mothers, fathers, grandparents, children, wondering if their lives will ever return to normal.
No matter the side, no matter the religion, images of death and destruction display the painful truth of a turning point amidst conflict that has persisted for generations with no end in sight. This resident of Ashkelon says we live in a reality that is not real. It is not normal to raise children like this, says this Israeli mother in her damaged home. A sentiment that knows no border. The trauma two-sided. The yearning for safety, something Israeli and Palestinian parents have in common. In Gaza, Palestinians flee their homes in anticipation of Israeli retaliation. Of course we're afraid, says this woman.
Thank you for watching Global News on this unprecedented day. We leave you tonight with the devastating images of the reality on the ground in Israel and Gaza right now, as bloodshed between both sides reaches a terrifying new stage in a war that's only just beginning.